This video is brought to you by Nebula. On Tuesday morning, hundreds of Ukrainian or pro-Ukrainian troops launched an incursion into the Russian oblast of Kursk. While it's hard to know exactly what's going on thanks to the fog of war, as of Thursday morning, it looks like Ukraine has captured a significant amount of Russian territory, and this is a far more substantial raid than the ones we saw into Belgorod last year. So in this video, we're going to have a look at what's happening in Kursk, Ukraine's possible motivations, and why, even if it's apparently been a success so far, at least at the time of writing, it's still a risky move, especially given how things are progressing in the east. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a bit of context. Since Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Ukrainian forces, or at least forces aligned with Ukraine, have been staging occasional incursions into Russia. While there were a handful of smaller incursions in 2022, the first large-scale incursion happened in May 2023, when two groups called the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russian Legion attacked a border post on the Belgorod-Ukraine border. For context, the Russian Volunteer Corps is a far-right Russian nationalist paramilitary unit with a slightly confused ideology. According to their founder, they don't like Zelensky because he's not an ethnic Russian, but they think Putin's worse because he's apparently turning Russia into a multicultural police state. The Freedom of Russia Legion, first formed in March 2022, is a unit consisting of Russian defectors and other Russian volunteers who oppose Putin's regime for other, more normal reasons. While both groups are aligned with Ukraine and have fought alongside the Ukrainian army has said that both groups are independent. While Ukraine denied having anything to do with the attack, it's hard to imagine it going ahead without sign-off from Kiev, and senior Ukrainian figures like spy chief Kyrylo Budanov strongly implied that Ukraine had ordered the attack. Nonetheless, because they weren't formally part of the Ukrainian army, this gave Kiev a degree of plausible deniability, which both made it harder for Russia to justify a retaliatory escalation and calmed nerves in Washington, where the Biden administration had long worried that attacks inside Russia might trigger a wider escalation. Anyway, the two groups advanced into Belgorod a bit, but were forced back in a couple of days. There was then another incursion in early June, where the two groups reached the town of Shebekino with the help of a third group, the Belarusian Volunteer Terror Battalion, but they were quickly repelled again. At the time, it was widely believed that these attacks were being directed by Kiev in order to put political pressure on Putin to wind down the war or accept a peace deal. These were accompanied by frequent drone and missile strikes into Russian territories bordering Ukraine, presumably for the same reason. Anyway, this is why, when there were a handful of reports about a Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast earlier this week, most people thought it would be fundamentally similar to the incursions into Belgorod, a short-lived escapade intended to spook Russian citizens and put internal pressure on the Kremlin to end the war. However, we're now a few days in, and it looks to be a significantly more substantial event. Before we get into it though, a quick caveat. Presumably to maintain a degree of plausible deniability and discourage retaliation from the Kremlin, Ukraine has been pretty silent about what's happening in Kursk, which means we sort of have to rely on comments made by the Kremlin and Russian military bloggers, so take everything here with a pinch of salt. Nonetheless, what seems to have happened is that, on Tuesday morning, something like 1,000 Ukrainian or pro-Ukrainian troops launched an assault on Kursk, with the support of Ukrainian artillery and Ukraine's new F-16s. The contingent essentially moved northeast from Sumy towards the Russian town of Sudza. The size of the force, plus the fact it was supported by tanks and F-16s, suggests that Ukraine is using conventional Ukrainian troops, not just pro-Ukrainian Russians. The Ukrainians were easily able to overwhelm the thin line of defensive troops Russia had along the border, and have now advanced up to 10 kilometers into Kursk, seizing a total of nearly 50 square kilometers, including the western part of Sudza. There are broadly two ways of reading this. The first is that this is basically an expanded version of the raids we saw in Belgorod. Ukraine has no intention of permanently holding territory here, and this is again about putting political pressure on Putin while simultaneously forcing Russia to redirect forces from the Eastern Front, even if Ukraine also has to do the same. If this is the case, it looks like Ukraine has been broadly successful. In a televised address on Tuesday evening, Putin looked visibly flustered.
Министерства обороны, Генеральным штабом ФСБ, имею в виду пограничную направлений деятельности Федеральной службы безопасности. И заслушаю очередной доклад коллег по тому, что происходит в Курской области.
Russia has had to deploy more troops to the area, although it's not clear if they're going to have to shift troops from the front lines or if local troops will be sufficient. The second interpretation is that Ukraine wants to permanently hold on to Russian land in Kursk. This would be ambitious, especially given the lack of defensive fortifications, the fact that Ukraine can't rotate out troops here, and the fact that Ukraine wouldn't be able to use HIMARS to hit Russian troop concentrations, thanks to American restrictions. But if Ukraine can do this without expending too many troops, which are desperately needed on the front lines in the east, this would be a massive win, for a couple of reasons. First, it suggests that Putin's threats of escalation are fundamentally empty. Even though Ukraine has occupied Russian territory and is now flying Western-delivered F-16s over Russian land, Putin hasn't escalated, at least not yet. Kyiv might try to use this to convince its Western backers that they should let the Ukrainians strike targets deep inside Russia, because the risk of escalation is actually minimal. Second, if Ukraine can hold on to Russian territory, it would seriously complicate any attempts by Russia to freeze the conflict along the current lines of control, which is something they've allegedly been pushing for in negotiations recently. If this were to happen, Ukraine could even offer Kursk back to the Russians in exchange for at least some of its own territory. Nonetheless, this still looks deeply risky. Holding territory in Kursk will almost definitely require constant infusion of resources, which Ukraine would otherwise be deploying to the front lines in Donbass or Kharkiv. If this redirection of forces either leads to a Russian breakthrough in the east or ends up being decimated by the Russian response, it'll end up looking like a massive strategic blunder that Ukraine can hardly afford at this point in the war. Keep diving deeper into this and other news stories over on Nebula, where the TLDR team curates the most important news videos from around the world, saving you from a deluge of bad news and helping you pay attention to what really matters. That means no more feeling out of touch. On Nebula News, the TLDR team acts as your guide through the media landscape, sharing the news we're paying attention to, helping you find stories that matter and avoiding burnout. If you don't know already, Nebula is the streaming service that we co-own with a bunch of your favourite creators. There you can watch original content like Real Life Law's incredible series War Room, which every month runs you through a whole load of ongoing conflicts, keeping you in the loop. You can also watch every TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in many instances before they land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, then click the link in the description to sign up now. If you do, you'll get 40% off an annual plan by using our link. Plus, Nebula will know you came from us, which really helps us out. We've got some really great feedback from existing members, so I hope you enjoy all the effort we're going to with Nebula News.